Hello.
Friends from the media, good morning. Welcome to today's anti-epidemic press briefing. We have with us the Chief Executive, and with her, we have the Secretary for Education and Director of Health. The Chief Executive and the Secretary will first deliver opening remarks, and then the floor will be open for questions. Please, meanwhile, observe social distancing here and wear a mask. Chief Executive will have the floor. Friends from the media, Hong Kong citizens, good morning. As I mentioned in yesterday's press briefing, there will be 3 tasks for this week with a view to retaining normalcy. And today, the topic is about resumption of classes. Many schools, meanwhile, have advanced their summer holiday. On the 21st of March, I announced that resuming face-to-face classes is an important element to our roadmap to fighting the epidemic. Since the 22nd of February, after the Chinese New Year, because of the serious epidemic situation, I announced that for schools, summer holiday would begin sooner. Previously, we requested schools to suspend face-to-face classes only, and that students could take classes online. However, at the time, we requested schools to start school holidays sooner. In hindsight, this decision helped Hong Kong dodge a very serious epidemic situation in schools. Because since the 22nd of February, the epidemic situation became much worse. And at this peak in March, we recorded about 70,000 confirmed cases. Imagine, within that period of time, if we allowed 800,000 students to go back to school for classes, you could imagine the huge risks of transmission. As for students between the age of 3 and 11, that is pre-primary and primary school children, the vaccination rate at the moment is still on the low side. So if we are not able to implement this decisive measure, then more students could become infected. Yesterday, the Center for Health Protection announced their analysis. From the start of the 5th wave until the 3rd of April, for children below the age of 18, there were 48 patients who had very serious or critical conditions. And among them, there is a high proportion of patients not yet vaccinated. So without this decision, I reckon the number of confirmed cases would further spike. As after we announced the roadmap of resuming face-to-face classes in schools, many schools have actively participated in fighting the epidemic, including using their school campuses as vaccination centers and dispatching volunteers to prepare anti-epidemic service bags. So on behalf of the Hong Kong SAR government, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to them. Since the 11th of March, on more than 6 or 7 occasions here, I've talked about school resumption. And I've stressed the importance of resuming schools for our children. Now, why is it that in relation to resumption of schools, I'm attaching so much importance to the matter? I'd like to read out something I wrote 19 years ago. 19 years ago, in 2003, Hong Kong was under attack by SARS virus, and my 2 children at the time were primary students. So I was the secretary by then. Perhaps many reporters here are quite young. You may not have received this book of mine. I wrote in this article that we should be prepared for resuming classes for school children. Let me read it out. I have 2 children, 2 sons. The classes have now resumed, and during dinner time, they told me about their happenings in school, and 12 water taps were installed to help children wash hands, and there were also disinfectant sprays and hand soaps. And for students without temperature record sheet, teachers would help take temperature from them. And I'm in strong support of schools resumption. Because of SARS epidemic, schools were suspended since the 29th of March, and it's been 1.5 months since then. The article was written on the 18th of May 2003. So with the epidemic situation under control, it's time for students to return to school and return to normalcy. I also support and schools in getting fully prepared for schools resumption so that parents can be reassured as they send their children back to school. 19 years on, we're facing a similar epidemic situation. So I'd like to thank schools for their preparation, and I'd like to reassure parents to allow their children to go back to schools. And in order to have full confidence, we need to arrange for children to be vaccinated. SARS only lasted for about 2 months, from March to May, before life returned to normal. However, for the coronavirus epidemic since 2020, 3 school semesters have been affected. In other words, the 3 cohorts of students have not been able to carry out learning activities in schools as they would normally do. Sometimes they could only rely on online classes, and even in the 5th wave of the epidemic, online classes have been suspended. I must admit that if we resume classes in schools, there may be risks, and I cannot rule out the fact that there might be a rebound. However, having considered and assessed the risk, the SAR government is of the view that we will be able to control the risk because we should put students' interests first. We believe after the Easter holidays, there will be the necessary conditions for resumption of classes. As you can see, the epidemic situation is now under control with a clear downward trend in terms of the number of cases. Now, we would insist that all teachers and students in school adopt the most stringent personal protective measures, including the wearing of masks and temperature checks before one enters the school campus, and that distancing should be observed. Second point, almost all teaching staff have now been jabbed, save for some with health reasons. So for school staff, they'll be subject to a vaccine pass requirement. The vaccine pass requirement, however, doesn't apply to school children. And meanwhile, school campuses have put in place improvement works to improve their ventilation system and disinfection for classrooms and school halls. The fourth point, for school children between the age of 12 and 19, 97 of them already received the first jab, and 78% received 2 jabs. As for school children between the age of 3 and 11, indeed the vaccination rate is not satisfactory enough for those with 1 jab, 62%, and those with 2 jabs, 58%. And that is why when we resume classes after the Easter holidays in phases, 2 measures will be adopted. First, teaching staff and students will need to undergo RAT or rapid antigen tests on a daily basis. They will only be allowed to enter if they have a negative RET result. If the RET result is positive, they will have to report to the director to the Department of Health as soon as possible. The SAR government has reserved $10 million for each school for the procurement of RET kits. We envisage some 300,000 students will be covered. The 10 million RET kits will be sufficient for the upcoming months for schools, and we will regularly review the situation. For example, we will, in our review, consider whether it is necessary to conduct daily RETs, and also whether it's necessary to increase the number of free RETs for schools. The second measure is that for school children, some of them are vaccinated, some of them have not been jabbed. We don't agree with the suggestion that unvaccinated students should be barred from going to school because of the implications, but then there should be separate treatment for the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. While they can still carry out learning in classrooms, for non-learning activities, there will be a different treatment for both groups. The vaccinated can take part in certain activities, but not the unvaccinated. This is to protect the unvaccinated students, because if they haven't been jabbed, and if they're mixed with those who have been jabbed, then for those who have been jabbed, there still might be infections, but then there will not be many severe cases. Whereas for the unvaccinated, if they get infected, their conditions may be very serious. Like I quoted just now, according to the CHP's statistics, 48 children were in severe and critical conditions, and they were unvaccinated. Of course, we'd also like to encourage parents to allow their school children to enjoy school life, and that they should be vaccinated as soon as possible. Because according to the CHP, even if you get only one jab, it will be a form of protection. I'll defer to Kevin to give you more details.
Media friends, as the Chief Executive just explained, schools in Hong Kong will, in accordance with the original plan, after the Easter holiday, resume classes. And we also, depending on the latest trend of the pandemic, we will orderly resume face-to-face classes by stages. Recently, we have discussed the matter with principals, and we know that the sector have been familiar with the arrangement for class resumption. So we're going to give them more flexibility to match schools' needs. And before resuming half-day classes, online teaching will be continued so students can learn at home. We have considered electrical members, school workers, parents, and various members of the public's views, and we have made the following professional judgments or decisions in relation to resumption of classes. For secondary schools, after the HKDSE core subject examinations are finished, that is from May 3rd, they will resume classes by stages. Schools can decide on the stages concerned. Would they first resume Form 3 to Form 5 classes, or if appropriate, schools can allow all forms to go back for face-to-face lessons. But the latest, by May 10th, the schools concerned should resume half-day of face-to-face lessons. Between May 3rd and 10th, those who cannot resume face-to-face classes or forms that cannot have face-to-face lessons, they can continue with online learning. For primary schools, because they don't have the consideration for HKDSE, after the Easter holiday, that is at the earliest May 19th, they can, by stages, resume classes for half-day. Same as secondary schools, the primary schools can decide how what are the stages concerned. But the latest, by May 3rd, the schools should have face-to-face lessons resumed. I hope you understand that primary students, as they are smaller, so schools might have to get better prepared before they can arrange for more students to return to school so that they can be adequately cared for and the students can adjust better. And same for secondary schools, Those forms which cannot have face-to-face class resumption can continue to learn online. For kindergartens, while the students are even smaller, after the Easter holidays, they would need more time to adjust campus life again. So in order to let schools adequately look after the students, we will resume classes by 3 stages. That is, 1/3 of students, approximately one form, will return to school for face-to-face lessons on May 3rd. And the other 2/3, that is about 2 forms of students, will resume face-to-face lessons after May 10th. And the school will, by May 16th, resume face-to-face lessons. So the arrangements are similar. Those who cannot have face-to-face lessons, they would continue to learn at home, online. For special schools and schools providing non-local curriculum, including international schools, they can make reference to their above arrangements I just announced, but depending on their own needs, we will allow them to have more flexibility. As for private schools providing non-regular curriculum like tutorial schools, they can at the earliest arrange for students to go for not more than half day of face-to-face lessons on May 4th. We also take stepped-up measures, say for schools to adopt more stringent precautionary measures to ensure environmental health, safety, and also to see what is more is needed to be implemented. And we will also carry out realistic, pragmatic precautionary measures in schools, for example, including increasing monitoring, that is RAT. School staff and students will need to, before they arrive at school, finish one round of RAT. And they must get a negative result before they can return to school for classes or work. Those who receive positive results should notice schools as soon as possible and the Department of Health. And schools need to report to the Department of Health about the results as soon as possible so as to ensure the safety of teachers and staff, and let the Center for Health Protection carry out more precise risk evaluation and try to, as much as possible, minimize the chances of schools having to suspend lessons. The Education Bureau will, for students in financial need, provide RAT kits. And that's what the Chief Executive just mentioned. And for arrangement of daily RAT, the government will, at the end of May, review the development of the pandemic and consider whether further adjustments are needed. So under the current arrangement, the Center for Health Protection will review school reports. If on the same day of lesson, the percentage of positive cases up to 5%, then the investigation will be carried out by the center, and follow-up measures may be undertaken to see whether a decision needs to be made on suspending classes. But schools with smaller number of positive cases, they can continue with the lessons with adequate precautionary measures. And if there are cases of close contacts, in the presence of adequate precautionary measures, school staff or students with contact with confirmed cases will not be identified as close contacts. Another stepped-up measure relates to vaccination. We will increase the incentives and requirement for vaccination. Actually, in February, vaccination pass was implemented on campus. Besides doctor certificate showing that the person should be exempted from examination, all school staff, anyone providing services on campus, and visitors must have received at least one jab before they can go to the campus. And all directly hired teaching and non-teaching staff before April 21st should have received 2 jabs. And after May 31st, after 5 months upon receiving the second jab, they should receive by then the 3rd jab. And we would directly linked vaccination with going to classes, but we would increase incentives and requirements for vaccination. Firstly, we think that there's a need to increase the demand for students to be vaccinated. For example, those who live in hostels, before May 15, the residents in student hostels must have received the 1st jab, and then the 2nd jab in due course.
學生
for kindergarten and primary school students requiring care in schools must be jabbed 2 times before they can allowed inside the school campuses for care. As for secondary school students, they are required to have 2 jabs. Of course, if you have a medical certificate to show that your condition is not suitable for 2 jabs, and also for those infected with COVID and recovered, they will be exempted. Second, for students who have received 2 jabs, schools may arrange them to take part in certain extracurricular activities such as sports, and these students will be allowed to carry out some activities that do not require the wearing of masks, such as blowing into or playing musical instruments. For the unvaccinated, they are not suitable for taking part in these extracurricular activities, and they should go home and rest after school. So unless care is needed, they should not remain in school after the half-day classes. As for older students, since they are more suitable to be vaccinated and there should be more time slots allocated in schools for learning, for schools with a 90% vaccination rate, depending on the actual circumstances, schools may arrange for secondary school students to resume full-day classes. For younger children between age 3 and 11, the overall vaccination rate is still on the low side, and their self-care ability is not as good as older students. Full-day classes will not be arranged at the moment, but we'll keep in view the situation. The third point is that we have completed the ventilation test for government and aided schools, and we have implemented improvement works. And for kindergarten schools, direct subsidy schools, and aided schools, we have provided a one-off grant for schools to conduct such ventilation tests to improve the ventilation system. The total commitment amounts to $70 million. We'll urge schools to complete this work as soon as possible, and if need be, install air purifiers. Before school resumption, the campuses will have to be thoroughly cleansed and disinfected. Schools will continue to observe strictly the guidelines issued by the Education Bureau and the Center for Health Protection. This set of guidelines is for schools. It contains anti-epidemic measures. For example, everybody in school campuses must wear a mask. They should observe social distancing, and at the entrance of schools, temperature checks should be carried out for teachers as well as students, and that they should make sure that the school campuses are clean and hygiene, and we will issue the revised guidelines for reference to schools in due course. And the Education Bureau will also issue a letter to all schools in Hong Kong detailing the school resumption arrangement. I'd like to thank all schools, parents, and students for your concerted effort in fighting the epidemic and for your cooperation with the government's anti-epidemic strategy. I hope that through the both anti-epidemic measures, we can keep our school campuses clean and safe so that we can provide a good learning environment for the benefit of teachers and students. Vaccination remains the most effective way to fight COVID-19 epidemic. It is effective in preventing deaths and severe cases. So I urge parents and schools to cooperate with us and arrange for students to be vaccinated. All right, the floor is open. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, and when your name is called, please state the media organization you represent and then use the mic. This reporter on the left-hand side at the back. I'm from Phoenix TV. First, about social distancing measures, when will you announce its relaxation? Are you concerned that the relaxation of social distancing measures and school resumption will cause a rebound? And what about schools' response to the revised guidelines? You mentioned that if there are sporadic cases in schools, there is no need to suspend classes. What if the sporadic cases happen in a single class? For the unvaccinated, they cannot take part in non-academic activities. Is it good enough incentive for them to get vaccinated? I'll answer the first question, and then Mr. Yang or the Director of Health can respond to you to the other questions. I announced the roadmap on the 21st of March. You may recall there are a number of areas. School resumption is one. The other is about relaxing social distancing measures. What I said was that if there is no rebound and if we continue to see a downward trend in terms of the number of confirmed cases, we will implement relaxation of social distancing measures in 3 phases. And within this week, together with another bureau chief, I will announce details of this roadmap. However, the social distancing measures that remain effective under the laws of Hong Kong will expire on the 20th of April. That means by then we need to announce the new strategy by then. That means the first phase of relaxing social distancing measures will be the 21st. School resumption will take place more or less by then. Each school have their own Easter holiday arrangements. Of course, every time we relax any anti-epidemic measure may entail risks, including school resumption, as I mentioned. That is why we need to be careful in assessing these risks, and we all need to put in our effort in helping schools return to normal. For example, we need to make sure that students observe personal hygiene. They should wear a mask, they should wash hands frequently, and they should observe social distancing. Similarly, for the social distancing measures that we will announce soon, we need to abide by certain principles. The other thing members of the public can work with us is vaccination. After all, what we don't want to see is a lot of serious cases overburdening our public healthcare system. In the 5th wave, at one point, the public healthcare system was on the brink of meltdown. There were a lot of COVID-19 patients and other patients stranded, waiting for a long time at the A&E unit. That is why we need to minimize the risk of transmission as we make a move to returning lives to normalcy. That is why we remind members of the public to receive the 2nd jab or the 3rd jab when time is right. And for the aged population, elderly people like myself, they should get the 4th jab so as to build a good foundation to prevent a rebound. Mr. Yang. On school resumption arrangements last week, we discussed the proposal with school councils and headmasters associations. In the past 2 years, as the chief executive mentioned, we tried suspending face-to-face classes or implement only half-day classes, so on and so forth. So teachers and parents fully understand these school resumption arrangements, and it is their common wish to see classes resumption as quickly as possible. This is for the interest of personal development of students and their learning. And of course, they are aware that anti-epidemic measures should be put in place. For example, mask wearing, washing hands, temperature checks. Schools have experience in implementing these measures, and they are confident that these measures could be put in place properly. Now, we've also seen successful implementation of these measures, and that is why we will leave the matter in the hands of schools. Some schools would like to resume in one go. Some would like to resume classes in phases, and they have the liberty to do so. On daily RATs, they have raised certain questions. For example, what about needy students? And that is why we are providing RAT kits to needy students. And about making reports to the Department of Health, we are drawing up special forms to facilitate the reporting. Now, we mentioned the 5% threshold. In other words, if there is 5% infection in schools, or what should be done vis-a-vis sporadic cases. But the Department of Health, of course, will carefully consider the circumstances of each school and consider whether the cases happen in one form or in a single class. And finally, whether extracurricular activities would provide a good incentive. Now, on the one hand, for the benefit of students' development, there should be more such activities. For example, according to recent surveys, students agree that their physical fitness have declined comparing to the pre-COVID level. So it is important that they continue to have other activities for the personal development. We, however, need to balance that with the academic development. That is why there should be separate treatment. For the vaccinated, they are relatively of a lower risk, and that for the unvaccinated, if they want to take part in these activities, it will be an incentive for them to get jabbed. The Director of Health.
Let me share with you 2 points. That is, once there's a pandemic in the schools, what our emergency arrangement will be. And secondly, from the public health perspective, why resumption of classes is so important. In relation to dealing with pandemic, after classes are resumed every day, the school staff and students are expected to perform RAT. And once there are positive results, there are 2 channels available. One is through our online RAT reporting platform to let us know. And secondly, schools each morning should gather all the data and through the Center for Health Protection report to our online website to let us know the number of positive cases. If there are no positive cases on that day, schools still need to let us know to ensure that we do not miss any positive cases. And once we receive the reports, we will carry out an analysis because we would be given information about the positive cases, the risks involved. And secondly, for the school themselves, we will be able to collect big data from them, and then we will see the distribution of positive cases in a particular school, what types of students are particularly affected, and so forth, any special situation, and so forth. And there are 3 objective indicators we'll adopt as criteria for emergency intervention follow-up action. The first indicator, as I said, is when all the students and teachers of them, more than or at least 5% of them are positive, then we will carry out an emergency investigation to see what measures need to be undertaken. Another indicator is if in a particular class or gathering, the overall positive cases reaches 10 or above %, then we'll need to take action. And the third indicator is we're particularly worried that whether the virus particularly targets certain types of people. Say, if a student develops a serious disease and needs to be admitted to ICU or even pass away, then we'll need to carry out an emergency investigation. So we hope that through all these actions, we can ensure that after classes are resumed, we can, in the shortest period of time, come to grips with the situation in schools and also intervene anytime when needed. In terms of public health, why resumption of classes is so important? Because if you have noticed, the WHO and United Nations, UNICEF, and also UNICEF and UNESCO have already strongly advised that even though the pandemic is prevailing, resumption of classes is an urgent and necessary measure. That's based on global figures which show that the COVID-19 virus, in terms of infection rate and impact, in comparison with other age groups, is not as risky and high. And secondly, in the environment of schools, the spread of the transmission, the risk concerned compared to other premises is relatively low. Besides these 2 points, much data also show that if classes are suspended for a long time, causing students to remain in school and deprived of face-to-face lessons and chances for socializing, in the long run, it would not be beneficial. It would have a detrimental impact on students' social and mental health. Data have shown that many students have developed, depression and all kinds of anxiety and so forth. And in terms of their psychological and physical health, we've seen, information showing that because of the reduced chances for activity and sports, and also changes in diets, the students might develop obesity or overweight issues. And also, if the students are, at home for a long time and spend a lot of time looking at online information, they could be subject to online bullying or develop online internet addiction. So because of all those data and evidence, we have seen that whether for physical, psychological, mental health, particularly for poor and grassroots families, the blow will be particularly heavy to them. Therefore, WHO recommends that because of the negative impact, which would have lifelong impact on the students as a result of suspension of classes and lack of socializing opportunities, we are recommending that we should try to strike a balance as soon as possible and let them resume classes. As the chief executive said, all these resumption measures are not risk-free, as the WHO has said. But still, what we need to do is to control well and implement good precautionary measures, including the infection control guidelines already distributed to schools. Personal hygiene is important, and the wearing of masks, that is the tight-fitting masks, is important. And in terms of the environment, there should be proper air ventilation and thorough cleaning and disinfection. Most importantly, we need to develop a good testing and pandemic control mechanism. That's why we are launching the RAT guideline. On the whole, we hope that through the controlled measures, we hope that the resumption of classes can begin orderly in phases. We want to say as well, in terms of local data, even though from age 0 to 9, the infection rate is 4.2%, lower than other age groups. Data also show that once infected with COVID-19, the chances of serious cases for those unvaccinated, the chances of having serious cases is 8 times that of the vaccinated. And once the school children are infected, for those vaccinated, we haven't seen any death cases among those vaccinated, among school children. For those who are not vaccinated or do not receive enough jabs, the death rate could be 0.01%. So I call on parents to actually vaccinate their children if you haven't done so. Even just one jab is better than not having any vaccine at all. Next, please. On the right, please. Gentleman there. In white. Yeah, on the side. Good morning. I'm from Now TV. I want to ask about the intervention by the Department of Health, and the 5% rate. Is there any scientific rationale for that percentage? And also, is that when the 5% happens, you will see where there are any concentrated cases. Does it mean that if the 5% is scattered in different classes, then there's a chance that the schools can still continue having face-to-face lessons? And just earlier, there are surveys that show that many parents don't want to have classes resumed in one go. So do they still have a choice if they want to continue online lessons? And for Mrs. Lam, experienced media personality, O'Connell, he was arrested this morning. You were with him at some programs. How would you evaluate the latest? What do you think of this latest arrest action? Some people think that this is a challenge to media freedom and also create a chilling effect.
I'll take the third question and then I will defer to my two colleagues to answer the other two questions. As a chief executive or any public official not in the law enforcement agency, I'm not in a position to comment on these cases, so I'm not going to comment. Safe to say that we have the rule of law in Hong Kong, and the implementation of the Hong Kong national security law seeks to safeguard national security. So, of course, we must abide by the core value we cherish, and we must therefore take enforcement action when there is a possible breach of the law. Freedom of the press is safeguarded by the Basic Law in Article 17, which also provides for various freedoms for individuals. And in the Hong Kong NSL Article 4, there is clear provision that the freedoms should also be safeguarded whilst safeguarding national security. I will defer to the Department of Health to take the question on the outbreaks in schools, and also Mr. Young to take your question on schools' response. Let me quote some figures to help you understand the situation. Under normal circumstances, whenever we have communicable disease outbreaks in schools, we have a set of guidelines covering different types of schools. And let me take seasonal flu as an example. The Scientific Committee on the Prevention of Communicable Diseases has drawn up a set of guidelines before on seasonal flu. For example, if there is a case of death, a case requiring ICU treatment, or if 20% of students in a school are infected, then the Department of Health should intervene on an emergency basis. So that's the existing guidelines for seasonal influenza. For COVID-19, we consider a number of factors. The transmissibility of the virus, for example. The first point we're clear is that Omicron clearly is more highly transmissible than seasonal flu. And next, we consider the implications of widespread transmission. For seasonal flu, the threshold is 20% infection. And in the current COVID epidemic, we have included teachers and other staff as well. And we also pointed out that for the infection rate in the fifth wave, for this age group, it's 4.2%. Now we compare this with the 20% threshold and other factors such as transmissibility, and we believe that the 5% threshold is the most suitable one. And this is drawn up on the basis of experts' advice as well. On the one hand, schools will need to report the number of confirmed cases to us. And on the other hand, individual teachers and students will make their own reports as well. If we assess the situation and find irregularity, we will intervene earlier as well. You mentioned parents' concern whether we should have territory-wide school resumption after the Easter holiday. Like many other issues in the community, there are always divergent views. We have struck a balance between the needs of students, the current epidemic situation, and the risks of teaching and learning in school campuses before drawing up this decision. Like the chief executive has explained, from the risk perspective, we would say that this is not a risk-free decision. And yet we also need to consider students' needs and social conditions, and we therefore find it necessary to resume schools after the Easter holiday. You will notice, of course, that we have a number of stringent measures such as daily RATs, improved ventilation in schools, and other anti-epidemic measures, which will make schools safer. You mentioned that some parents may decide not to let their children go back to school. I want to say that after resuming schools, schools are no longer required to provide online learning for their children. And if parents decide not to send their children to school, you must bear in mind that under the current mechanism, there is a statutory requirement for children between the age of 6 and 15 to receive education in schools. However, should parents decide not to allow the children to go back to school, these cases will be dealt with according to the mechanism. Next question, this lady reporter here.
SCMP. Can you update the latest number of people who joined the universal RAT testing? And what are the future uses of RAT apart from schools and special events? And the second question is, the government issued a statement yesterday saying that the CE may direct the holder of another public office to exercise the power delegated to the CS in granting exemptions from compulsory quarantine or social distancing rules. So in the absence of an acting CS, who can John Lee's campaign office reach out to if they wanted to be exempted from social distancing rules regarding his election campaign? And do you mind clarifying the statement? And is there any latest updates on the successor of John Lee? Thank you.
I do not have the figures that you asked for, because apparently you were asking how many Hong Kong people have joined the RAT exercise. I have repeatedly explained that we will not have that information. One is because the rapid antigen test exercise is a purely voluntary one. Secondly, if a person has taken an RAT but is negative, there is no need, no obligation whatsoever for the person to report to a Center for Health Protection. So we will not know how many Hong Kong residents have over the last 3 days responded positively to our appeal and had taken a daily rapid antigen test. But if your question was about how many were found positive and declared to the Center for Health Protection, we could give you a global figure on a daily basis at the 4:30 press conference. I do not have the information that is going to be announced by the Center for Health Protection this afternoon. But what has been announced over the last 2 days are figures in the public domain already. So you should be able to find those figures. Now, about future uses of rapid antigen test as an anti-epidemic measure, and also as a measure to ensure that we could resume normalcy in a gradual and orderly manner. We are telling you this morning that in order to reduce infection risks in schools, once students are going to go back to school learning, Initially, we have not said that this will be forever, but initially for a period, we would require all the staff, the teachers, and the students to take daily rapid antigen test, and they could only go into the school if the test is a negative one. If it is a positive one, that they have to notify the school and declare to the Center for Health Protection for any follow-up actions. Whether similar daily rapid antigen tests or frequent rapid antigen tests or ad hoc rapid antigen tests will be applied in a particular scenario is something that we will need to consider further. I gave you another example yesterday is when social distancing measures are to be relaxed from the 21st of April, people will ask about local group tours, because you remember at a certain point in time, although we did not have a lot of inbound tourists, but we do encourage more local tours so that there will be jobs for the tourism industry, but also enable Hong Kong people to enjoy themselves. So if there is a group tour, and it is safer if all the participants in a group tour will be able to do a RAT before they board the cruise ship or the coach, then that may be one of the scenarios that we will consider. But we will tell you after we have ironed out all the details. The second set of questions concerning the vacancy of this position of the Chief Secretary for Administration. At this point in time, I have nothing to add to what I have already said in public. So, which means that at this point in time, the position of the CES, the Chief Secretary for Administration, remains vacant. But as I have said on several occasions since the resignation and departure of John Lee, all the work to be done by the Chief Secretary for Administration will continue and has been continuing in the last week or so, because one is we could ask the relevant bureau secretaries to do the work and then to escalate to my personal attention. Because very often the Chief Secretary of Administration is a higher level to the Bureau Secretary, but ultimately responsible to the Chief Executive. For example, in processing submissions to the Executive Council, then the ultimate authority rests with the Chairman of the Executive Council, which is the Chief Executive. But where the power to be exercised by the Chief Secretary for Administration is a statutory power, is laid down in the ordinance, then we have a means to overcome it. Because in the laws of Hong Kong, there is Cap 1, I think it's the Interpretation and General Clauses Ordinance, which gives a lot of power to the Chief Executive. One of the powers is if a particular public office is vacant, in other words, no person has been appointed to fill that public office, but the laws of Hong Kong do give that public office certain powers to exercise. Then under special conditions, that is when the post is vacant, then the Chief Executive could, by order, it is a legal instrument, I have to sign an order to direct another public officer to discharge those functions. And that's why we need to clarify this position via a press release yesterday, because apparently there was a saying that because the post of CS was not filled, and even the Chief Executive could not do anything about it. So there are certain statutory functions that could not be discharged. That is not the case. The CE will be able to rectify or resolve that sort of situation by invoking Cap 1 to appoint by order another public officer to discharge that function. So we have already done it once by order to direct another public officer, another principal official, to grant exemptions under Cap 599C to facilitate the arrival of mainland experts last week without subject them to quarantine. Because they came to help us. What's the point of putting them in a 7-day or 14-day quarantine. So another public officer has been directed via an order to exercise that power of exemption. And we will, depending on the situations and the circumstances, continue to direct principal officials by order. But it will vary from one to another, and there are other occasions that we need to resolve. So if ultimately, as we said in a press release, we will facilitate the conduct of elections of the 6th-term chief executive in accordance with the law. So if any candidate's campaign office wishes to seek any exemptions which are in the public interest, because we want this election to be smooth, efficient, lawful, then they can approach the Hong Kong SAR government. The easy way is to approach the CE's office or the director of the chief executive's office and need not try to find out which principal official has been given the power by the chief executive. Thank you.
Well, I think it's about noon, so that's the end of the press conference today. See you on Wednesday.